In today's big interview, we talk with KW Miller about Eskom. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Miller. Your YouTube videos that you've been compiling about Eskom, quite dramatic. Certainly one of them went pretty viral, and it's very outspoken. Of course, when I told the business community that I would be talking with you, not surprisingly, some of them went online, found out stuff about you, threw it back at me and said, "Why are you talking to this crazy guy?" Do you get that much?
Well, we'll call it the cabal, always pushes back against truth and justice. So that's not to be unexpected, Alec.
And just so that we can put it in perspective, there was a website called rightwingwatch.org. I'm sure you've read all about it. It had a full go at you when you stood for Parliament or for American as an independent candidate in Florida in July 2020. Is there anything in there or that affects the message that we're going to be talking about in a moment?
Nothing. Right Wing Watch is funded by George Soros and that crowd. So, when you do the things I do globally, and you push back against the socialist agenda, you push back against the green fraud, which is basically what we'll talk about today, which is basically being pushed onto South Africa and other, what we'll call conservative agendas. You're going to be attacked. So I'm attacked globally for what I do. It's just part of the business.
So what do you do?
I restructure energy companies and sovereign debt. I restructure anything to do with energy industrial assets for governments, for creditors, for all stakeholders. It could be any of the above and many more.
And are there any you can tell us about that you have done?
I think today's date would be too long. I would suggest people, if they want to know more about what I do, go to our portal, CRO Advisors, or go to LinkedIn or others, and you'll see a plethora of data, articles, analysis, prior work, other things. So that I've been doing this 30 years. I've been out there for a long time. So there's nothing, there's no secret per se in what I do. The clientele and how we do it, that's a different story. That is confidential in many cases. But when you deal with something like an Eskom in such a global public problem, you're dealing with a cornucopia of creditors from around the world. And the easiest way to say that is, Alec, South Africa and Eskom owe people a lot of money, and that's why I'm here.
Well, we know from the medium-term budget presentation last week that there's 400 billion rands in debt, which South African taxpayers are going to be taking over, something like 130 billion to 260 billion rand into the pool that Treasury has to look after. Why do you think it's coming at this point? And we'll talk in more detail about the way that you've analyzed that the debt is far larger than 400 billion. But why would the South African government at this point in time be making these kind of utterances?
Well, look, Alex, I think you have to address it from 2 points. One is, three actually. One is the debt is much higher. Would you like me to talk about the real debt now, or would you like to hold off on that? We can get into it now.
In a minute. Just the timing of the because they've kicked the can down the road for must be 15 years now, and suddenly we now see that the ANC government, is starting appears to be grasping some kind of nettle.
Okay, let's get to the facts. Eskom's real debt, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is over 75% of South Africa's total debt. Eskom is South Africa, for lack of better terms. So when you look at South Africa from a credit point of view or from a country risk point of view, Eskom and South Africa are one. That's a fact. Now, number two, putting some portion of Eskom's debt on South Africa's treasury balance sheet is nothing more than a shell game. It's irrelevant to the problems on the ground and the problems financially in the global capital markets. Because at the end of the day, we already look at South Africa and Eskom as one debt bubble, okay? And so whether you move the debt to Eskom to South Africa Treasury or to some other, government guaranteed entity. It's all one piece of debt. And the reality of that, Alec, is that South Africa on paper is technically insolvent when you do the math, and we can talk about that.
So are you saying that Eskom in South Africa are one because so much of the Eskom debt is government guaranteed?
It's government guaranteed, and it's a government and parastatal entity. And it's 100% dependent on government handout.
So
So
the
it is
shell game.
It is South Africa. There are no other funding mechanisms for Eskom in the markets. Eskom is, for all practical purposes, dead in the capital markets. They cannot borrow anywhere in the capital markets today. They have to go to the South Africa Treasury. The South Africa Treasury has to come to the global capital markets to borrow its money through South African bonds. And so it's one for all practical purposes. It's very important for your viewers to understand. There is no Eskom borrowing, and it's all one big credit bubble. We look at it together as one massive credit risk.
So the shell game that you're talking about, what we heard last week from the finance minister and in the medium-term budget was actually just shifting deck chairs in a way, in that this is government debt anyway with Eskom. There's no way that that debt will not be repaid by the sovereign. So to just shift it from one part to another part it was all going to be taxpayer funded in the end.
That's exactly right. You just hit the nail on the head. The short answer, Alec, is the 8% of South Africans that actually pay tax, they pay 80% of the taxes, are basically being asked to pay 100% of the Eskom debt via the South African Treasury for all practical purposes. So remember, South Africa has a very small tax base and it has a massive debt. So when you look at the numbers, it's inverted. South Africa, for all practical purpose, like I said to you, and I'll go through the numbers with you if you'd like, South Africa is viewed in the capital markets as it's a debtor nation for sure, but it's insolvent on paper. Now, does that mean that the South African Treasury won't be able to continue to borrow? No. There's always a lender for crazy interest rates and for emerging market debt. But the problem now is South Africa's tax base is so low and is so damaged, and the infrastructure is falling apart, that investors are now understanding that they can't continue. They can't continue with the bottomless pit, and that is the fundamental reality of South Africa today. And it's a sad statement. It pains me to say it. I love South Africa, but the reason I'm also involved is because we need to fix this problem, and it's going to take a long time.
How are you going to help to fix the problem if you are being so critical of those who presumably would be appointing the person to fix it?
Well, let's talk about that. The reality of the world is, Alex, is we deal in facts and figures. And in the energy and infrastructure business, while politics plays a little role at the top, okay, in theory, at the end of the day, when you run your assets into the ground, okay, and I will tell you this for your viewers. I've been doing this over 30 years. I've seen as ugly of an energy complex problem as you can see. I've seen bad power plants. I've seen bad companies. I've seen over-leveraged companies. I've seen everything you can imagine, from debt problems to operational problems and everything in between. South Africa's Eskom is as bad as I've seen in my entire career, because it has every single problem you could imagine in a restructuring, financially and operationally. And these are the facts that the South African taxpayers have started to understand. So in 2019, when we put out the first definitive CRO report on Eskom, then we followed up with the definitive debt restructuring and subsequent analysis. We, as you know, got a lot of pushback from, we'll call it the cabal. The cabal is the current government and the criminal syndicates who are milking the system. Now, we sat back and we said to the creditors, your investment's worth zero. There's nothing you can do right now. Sit back and just, because there's nowhere to go. You're stuck. And then 3 years later, what is it, 3 years later now, Alex, since we first talked? Give or take, the wheels have started to really come off, right? I think you're starting to see that on the ground. And what you're seeing is the South African people who actually are involved in the process have come to us over the last 3 years systematically, and it's growing. And it's now reached what we'll call a crest, meaning the operators, the engineers, the financiers, the average educated South African who got a college degree, who's now middle class, even the poorer South Africans who are just watching the news, they're emailing and texting. They want to know why this is happening. And so you add that with the fact that the operations have collapsed, and we can talk more about that. And then the fact that the ANC, the government in power today, and by the way, I'm not a politician, is broke. And you put all those together, and then you look at the massive debt bubble, and you say, okay, the wheels have pretty much come off of South Africa, because when you take out the power generation out of the industry, you can't run your plants, you can't run your smelters, you can't run your mines, you can't run your light industrial manufacturing. And so your economy starts to collapse. So when Eskom goes down, for all practical purposes, Alec, the economy goes down in South Africa. And I want people to understand this is not something that's going to be solved by renewable energy. Why? Renewable energy is good for intermittent power for little pockets. South Africa has a immediate 30,000 megawatt baseload generation problem. Okay, it's really 35,000 with enough reserve margin. That is not going to be replaced by wind and solar. Number two, wind and solar in South Africa is compromised because it's above market PPAs guaranteed by the South African government, and it's wrought with fraud. It's wrought with fraud. All of the contracts have kickbacks, embezzlements. The machine is getting their kickbacks. So the South African taxpayers are being ripped off again, not only by having load shedding, but all these new renewable contracts, which are not going to be productive to South Africa on a whole, are basically, it's a corrupt cabal. So when you look at the big picture, the losers here are the South African citizens, and that's who we're trying to represent. So yes, will the current government push back? Of course they're going to push back, because they've got nowhere to go. Will the corrupt criminal cabal who is involved in fuel fraud, coal fraud, diesel fraud, O&M fraud, equipment fraud, stealing everything that's not nailed down, will they push back? Absolutely. I want to tell you that I talk to the unions almost daily. We WhatsApp, I talk to the stakeholders. Everybody who's involved, even the ANC and the DA I talk to. It doesn't mean that I expect them to like what we have to say, Alec. What I do is I tell everybody the same thing. We don't divert our message. We don't tell the ANC one thing, the DA something else, and the union something. We tell them all the same thing, the good, the bad, the ugly. And we tell them, this is coming, this is happening, it's here. Now we have to deal with it. How are you going to act? So yes, there are people who are very unhappy about the message, but there are others who are basically rejoicing, saying, amen. Thank God somebody's come in with adult supervision who has the horsepower and is not politically motivated, essentially, to actually start to work on this problem for all South Africans. So I hope that answers that question.
How big is the hole today? How big is the debt?
The hole for South Africa. Well, debt. Let's talk about Eskom first. Okay, Eskom's got 500 billion rand in debt by our analysis on balance sheet. It's got about 130 billion off balance sheet, and it's got a need for about another 1.1 trillion rand. So it needs South Africa, aka Eskom, needs about 1.7 to 1.8 trillion rand to keep the lights on and keep the machine going the next 5 years. That's nursing along the current coal fleet, Alec. Okay? Because I think you would agree, and everybody who understands the problem in South Africa understands that if the coal fleet falls down, South Africa is dead. It dies. You forget renewables. That's all bullshit. Pardon my French. If we don't keep the coal fleet up and running and nurse it along and somehow address that asset base, South Africa will literally die economically. That's a fact. And so South Africa has to accept that. And we've got to push back on this. That's why the Soros organization and others hate what we do, because we're pushing back on this green agenda, which is completely fraud. Let me give you some examples, and I want your viewers to hear it. The U.S. in 2009, I put out a big article and a big write-up on the green and renewable effort in the U.S., and it's all public. We said it's going to fail. It's doomed for failure because it doesn't address system reliability, base load power, all of the critical issues required to run a power grid. California shut down their natural gas power plants and other thermal generation. Now, in the state of California, which is the fifth largest economy in the world, they're having rolling blackouts. The system is unstable and they're in desperate shape. Texas built massive wind parks in West Texas, kind of like the Western Cape for you. And they basically built these wind parks in constrained, congested areas, just like South Africa. And the wind gets ground into the ground. In other words, the generation that they create doesn't get to the consumer because it cannot get through the transmission grid's congestion. Number two, it's only 25% load factor at best. So it's not solving the problem, and it's creating an unstable grid. Germany, I spent a big part of my career in Europe. I ran EDF's European portfolio, Electricity de France. I told the Germans, do not shut your coal and thermal plants down back in the 90s. But they went forward, as you know, under Angela Merkel with the Green Deal. So they've now, or you know what they're doing, Alec? They're bulldozing wind parks that are sitting on top of coal fields to create more space for the coal mine to basically refire their coal plant because they cannot keep their lights on in Germany. So Europe has failed. And the same thing in the UK. We went through the process with the coal plants in the 2000s. My point is, all of these green initiatives as a whole have failed in Europe and the US. Now, I'm not saying that wind and solar doesn't provide power. It doesn't provide the stability and the baseload generation necessary. The problem that South Africa has is they don't have access to natural gas, wholesale natural gas. So in Europe and the US, we can always build natural gas combined cycle plants to fill the gap relatively quickly in 4 or 5 year cycles for combined cycle plants. In South Africa, we don't have that option. Case in point, the peakers that are keeping South Africa's lights on today, the oil-fired or diesel-fired peakers that are primarily in the Western Cape, are the only thing keeping the grid alive, okay, when the coal plants are starting to fall down. Now, that's not going to last forever. We just put out a piece saying that the peakers are in desperate operating shape. So the point of the matter, Alec, is it's broken. And it's broken because it's been subjected to years and years and years of neglect, corruption, fraud. That's a general statement that comes out of it. So when you do the math and you say, why do we need 1.1 trillion rand? Because you've ignored your system for 20 years and you've stolen everything that wasn't nailed down. The system is the worst system I've seen in the world. It's just been, you can't make this up. I get up in the morning sometimes when I'm working on this and I think I'm living a dream because nobody would have done this to any operating system around the world. You would think, because even the crooks need power. Even the criminal syndicates need power. They're even coming now and saying, through the grapevine, God, we got to fix this. You can't embezzle from companies unless you have electricity. The whole system is absolutely broken.
Yeah, I think it's what you're saying now. Had you said it 2-3 years ago, people would say, "No, come on, this guy really is nuts." But we've had the Zondo Commission. We've had an ANC socialist government which was defending its monopoly on power for decades, and now it's just thrown in the towel. It said, "Well, anybody can put any power plant they want to." They've given up on that ghost. So clearly, there was a very strong reason for them to give up. We understand, and I don't think anybody can criticize. They might look at the quantums, but they can't really criticize the message. But now it's where to from here. What is your solution for this big, deep pit that the country is in?
Okay, I'm not a politician. Let me say this. The political regime in South Africa is going to have to sort itself out on its own, right? One way or the other. So what I do is I focus on the issues, the money, the operations, the operators, the details of how to fix the problem. We've got to pull, and we're planning to pull the coal plants out of Eskom's operational control and put it into a special purpose vehicle, Alec. Okay, that special purpose vehicle will be funded by outside money. Maybe creditors, maybe others will figure that out. We're working through the numbers now. The operations team has to come under the control of what we'll call a special purpose vehicle. Okay, all of the fuel contracts have to come over. So we need to isolate the coal plants and the peakers. and put them into a special purpose entity that will still provide power to Eskom under some contractual structure, so that we can nurse that along to keep South Africa alive. But it has to be two conditions minimum. Okay, the macro conditions. One, the government has no involvement, no control. They cannot get involved and linger in the process. Number two, we control all of the fuel contracts because we have to cut the fraud. The only way we can clean this up, because the coal contracts are wrought with fraud. They've destroyed the boilers by poor quality coal, baiting and switching. They're providing, they're skimming all the diesel. I mean, they're burning 10 billion liters of diesel a day. They're going to spend 20 billion rand in 2023 on diesel alone, minimum 20 billion rand just on diesel. It's the numbers are ungodly, Alec. Okay, so that has to happen. We've already started the process of basically pulling the operators into the mix. I can't say much about it, but let's just say that we already have what we need operationally to run this portfolio, because these people are in South Africa and they're not very far away. If they, it will bring in others, but most of them are already in South Africa. And remember, South Africa has engineers. South Africa has operators. They've been put out to pasture because of fraud, corruption, and other things. And also, many of them are still working inside Eskom. And they talk to us every day. We talk to everybody, Alec. This is not done in a vacuum. We're heavily involved in what's going on operationally every day. But it's just not we don't talk to Eskom management, and we don't talk to the government about those matters because they're really not in control. The control lies elsewhere. And that's what I think is important from 2019 to today, is that control has shifted. Okay. And everybody has realized that they really don't have a choice. One way or the other, they don't have a choice.
Many years ago, must be 12 years ago, Howard Buffett, Warren Buffett's son, and very involved in Berkshire Hathaway and Berkshire Hathaway Energy in the United States, who had at that stage a farm in South Africa, offered to get involved with Eskom. He even sent over interaction with some of the guys at Eskom. I helped them because I knew both sides to put them together. And it seemed eminently sensible, but nothing came of it because Eskom refused to take outside help. What makes you think that all this work that you're doing now is going to actually trigger an understanding that help needs to be embraced this time around?
You want to, a simple answer, it's money. And the reality is the ANC is broke. And I think you've had some economic guests on in the past who talk about macroeconomic issues and the mindset of the South Africans. But the reality is the current government is broke. Okay, they're broke in their own personal coffers, and they're broke as a treasury. Okay, because this cannot continue. They've hit the wall. I'm not saying they can't nurse it along for a little bit longer, Alec. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure they can nurse it along, and it's all about a matter of, are South Africans willing to accept 10, 12 hours of load shedding? And when the grid does collapse, which it will, it's inevitable, because remember, we're dealing with machinery here. Leave the government, leave the political, leave the financial equation out. Just focus on machinery. Operational equipment fails without proper maintenance. And we're talking about heavy, heavy, heavy equipment here, okay? So there's no operating reserves for maintenance. Everything that gets spent gets skimmed. I can tell you for a fact, we know the numbers. We see the details. We get everything that happens at these plants is fed to us in one form or another, Alec. Okay, the operating fleet. We see what's happening on the ground. We see what's happening still at Medupi and Kasili. The fraud is off the charts. It's out of control there still. Those plants will never perform. So when you put all this together, you put it down to a number, right? And I said to you, 1.7 to 1.8 trillion is the number. 1.1 trillion rand is to keep the lights on. And the balance of that is the Eskom debt regime. They owe a lot of people money, okay? And that 1.1 trillion that needs to come in, it's not coming from the treasury, and it's not coming from South African industry. It's got to come from somewhere else, okay? Now that's on the low side, Alec. So when you look at why now will things change? Not may not change today or tomorrow, but it's moving in that direction, is because the wheels have come completely off financially, operationally, and yes, politics does have a play because you remember people are emotional. When people don't have water or power or food or raw sewage in their street, even the South African poor understand that that's not right. And I think you're seeing a lot of ground being gained in South Africa with the former members of the party who have become disenchanted on all sides and really do want change. Okay, they do want basic water, they want basic electricity. And by the way, for your viewers, I'm going to give you a heads up now. The South African water system is on the verge of collapse up in the Gauteng area. It's a mess, and I think we're going to see. I think you're going to see the next crisis in South Africa be water. But we'll get to that. But water, we focus on it because it's needed for power plants.
Mm. Mm.
So with that said, you come to a point where you can only cannibalize your economy so much. There's really nothing else to cannibalize. Everything's been stolen, Alec. There's nothing else they can continue. The only thing keeping the criminal syndicates alive in South Africa, you want to know the truth? The coal contracts that they skim off of, the diesel contracts, the renewable contracts. Those are the real money. All that money gets skimmed off by various actors in South Africa, and it completely wrecks the energy system there. And these are the facts that have been going on for many, many years, and now it's all come home to roost. So yeah, I think the bottom line is it's coming down to money, Alec, and it's not about power, it's not about control, because a megawatt's a megawatt, right? I mean, we don't, a megawatt's non-political. It goes on the grid in an amorphous state. It keeps, it's all about balancing the grid and keeping the industrial capacity alive. Now, give you a case in point. We have record high coal prices. Did you realize that South Africa can't get that coal to port? It's having problems. Anglo and their people are having problems getting that to port. Well, guess what that does to the royalty revenue for South African government? When you have this,
it's well articulated that
yeah,
that because there is Transnet has capacity of 80 million tons on its rail lines at the moment. It can only deliver 50 million tons. So it's a mess all the way through. But I think just to close off with, the real question that South Africans would have is, okay, all right, I get it. This guy might be a little crazy, but we get it. He knows his energy story. He knows the Eskom story. I can't argue with what he said because the evidence is in front of us with load shedding. But how are you going to get those who can make the decisions to listen, to implement any plan, let alone your plan, but any plan? Or is it something that you are so confident of because the creditors of Eskom, those who hold Eskom stock or Eskom bonds in the international markets, are just going to insist it?
Well, Alec, I mean, let's address your first point. I must be crazy because I'm involved in this mess. That's probably where I might be a little
True.
off, right? Because typically executives like me would walk away from this. But I am one of the best restructuring guys in the energy business, and that's why I'm involved. That's why I was brought in. I deal with the ugliest of the ugly. So yeah. So when you say I'm a little bit mad, I think we probably would agree that I think we're all mad for trying to fix this problem. Now, I'm passionate about helping South Africa because I've been involved personally in the country for so many years. You're asking the magic question, okay? And the answer is we don't know, okay, when the house of cards will completely collapse. Now, there are those out there, including myself in the industry, who, I'm talking about in South Africa, who would say the current government is and the corruption is so severe and the malfeasance and the fraud and it's so severe that they just going to basically let it whittle down to a nub, meaning load shedding will go to a stage 8, the grid will collapse at some point, they'll keep a few plants operating, they'll nurse it along, and the South African people will have to suck it up, right? Well, that's pretty much, I think, where they are today, right? If you want to ask a professional view, that's where the South African government is today. Just nurse it along, and because look, let's go back to what we're basically saying on the front end. Forensic audit is required. Now, I will tell you for a fact that the current government will never allow a forensic audit of Eskom because they will go to jail. Okay, I could swear out affidavits in The Hague and put about 10 to 15 of the senior ANC officials in jail today if the creditors wanted to do it. Meaning we could basically take them into international courts for all the things they've done with the creditors' money. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
That's international investors. But what good is that? They've already got billions parked offshore in Mauritius and other places. So everybody understands that the money's gone. What I'm dealing with is the facts. And what we're dealing with is the facts. The facts are the system's broken. How do we keep the lights on and how do we plan for the next 10 years? So I go back to the simple answer, and maybe we just focus on this. It all comes down to money. The money train has run out for all of the bad actors, and at some point, they cannot afford to carry on the way it's carrying on because we're talking about massive numbers here, Alec. We're talking about 130 to 150 billion US to clean this up. That's a big number.
Those are big numbers. Well, certainly even in US terms, but in South African terms, they're gigantic.
We put out two notices. I'm going to leave this with you because I think everybody needs to understand. One is we declared a state of emergency in the South African energy market. We did that last week. Okay, you'll hear more about it. Number two, we've declared Eskom the biggest energy industrial Ponzi scheme in global history. The numbers are off the charts. Eskom is a massive Ponzi scheme. When you look at how it's basically been completely undone from within, okay, over the years, and all of the corruption and fraud that's ongoing in the contracts today, even while the wheels are falling off, the fraud and corruption on all the operating contracts, the maintenance contracts, the fuel contracts. It's astounding. It's something that most people can't even comprehend. So you're right. Yeah, is it a mad situation? It's the worst I've ever seen, and it's the worst people like me, I think, would agree we've ever seen. And it's not a fun statement to make. It's not, but it's a reality. And so until people react to the reality, we'll never make that move. So I think it goes down to the current government running out of cash. You know, Eskom doesn't have any money. They don't have any cash. They have no reserves. They have no maintenance reserves. They have no financial reserves. They have nothing.
KW Miller is the chairman of CRO Advisors, and I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.